Chapter 4. I was greeted by a receptionist who directed me to a small office. The man within was cordial and seemed rather surprised at my offer. I placed most of the bills I had on his desk. $4,780, he repeated after counting them. I outlined to him how I expected to transact this business with the least possible delay. He suggested that I might go into the client's office, which adjoined his. "You can use one of the desks," he explained, "and the switchboard girl will connect your phone to mine. I'll relay your transactions immediately." He opened a door and guided me into a medium-sized room, which was rather ornately decorated, to my eyes, and I selected a small table and a chair. There was a telephone on the table and an instrument just to the right of the table, which he called a teletype. Another peculiar affair stood in the center of the room called a stock ticker. Fortunately, there was another man in the room who would provide me with the much-needed information. I thanked the broker, seated myself at the table, and contemplated the many written records which were affixed to the wall before me. I selected my first purchase easily, no longer having to plot the effects of my winning upon anyone. In fact, they were anxious that I should win. Shortly after I had telephoned my selection, I notified the broker to sell. He complimented me with a "nice going." I gave him another selection then, and began probing the mind of the man next to me. Little by little, a plan began to form. I observed that by rapid transactions, I could, within a very short time, double the investment over and over again. It would take relatively few transactions, yet the gain on each would have to be enough to offset the brokerage fees. I began applying myself in earnest, buying and selling items that I had little knowledge of, if any at all, with a speed that caused my companion in the room to stare at me curiously. Then an opportunity came which afforded a drastic gain. I attempted to appear nervous as I waited for the outcome. The other man in the room became as tense as I appeared to be when he saw the results. Finally, I muttered a cryptic, "Sell it," into the telephone. Now I decided to obtain a good deal of assistance from the other speculator. "This one's going to rise a point," I murmured. "Frankly," the man answered, "I'm going to try another couple blocks of United. It'll fall a half a point and come up slow." "What makes you so sure?" he asked, managing to smile and appear worried at the same time. "I've been checking on this for months," I said. He regarded me for a moment, then murmured into his phone, "I'll take 2 blocks at Great Western. Sell on United." He looked sheepish then and devoted himself to some calculations on a sheet of paper. Once or twice he glanced up at me as I waited, trying also to appear busy. Then they came over the teletype. My companion threw his pencil into the air and gleefully ordered the sale of his Great Western blocks. With a happy smile, he laid the phone down. "That was a nice piece of change," he chuckled. Then he became more serious. "But how did you do it?" "As I said, I've been getting things lined up for months on this. I may miss once or twice today, but that's all." "Tell me more about it," he urged. I lowered my voice, trying to sound confidential. "This one," I said, pointing to a list, "will rise half a point in the next hour. Gives me time enough to eat." I picked up my telephone and placed an order. My companion, I noted, did the same. "Would you care to join me for lunch and a drink?" he asked. "Thank you," I replied, "and don't mind if I do." I put down my pencil and paper, and we walked out. We each paused and notified our respective agents that we would return, then left the office. We were silent in the elevator, but once on the main floor, my companion began talking. "You really had some fast turnovers this morning." "Not too bad," I muttered deprecatingly. "There's a nice little one coming up after lunch, though." "Oh?" I smiled, indicating superior knowledge. Well, how about a drink? My companion suggested. I agreed, and we soon were seated in a place that specialized in beverages. The man who did the serving got a mumbled order from my companion, and I merely nodded my head to indicate the same. The mental picture in my mind was a rather pleasant flavor, so when the glasses were placed before us, I drank deeply. My companion uttered a sigh of satisfaction, while I struggled to keep the nauseating liquid down. My throat burned, and my stomach quivered from the impact of the impossible fluid. By exercising all the control possible, I managed to show no outward signs of my discomfort. I blinked back involuntary tears and resolved to myself to neither eat nor drink without exploring the contents first. Then I began to feel reactions beclouding my mind. The fumes of the sickening stuff swept into my nostrils at each breath. I maintained a thoughtful look as though appreciating my friend's dreadful selection. I noted, too, a vague dizziness. I asked my companion a question or two and introduced myself while attempting to organize my nervous system. A frantic thought from Almondo, who had partaken of my confusion, had to be dealt with. "I'm perfectly all right," I flashed. "A mere oversight on my part. I'm not injured." My new friend revealed his name as Jim Evans. I allowed his conversation to roll on with only occasional comments. He was making careful plans in his mind, and I found myself decidedly in agreement. Almondo remained unpersuaded, yet I now seemed in control of myself. He left off with a disturbed thought about my condition. I reassured him again that I would return to normal as soon as I'd eaten. Then I asked Jim Evans, "Well, shall we have lunch now?" "I guess so," he replied. "I have to get back to work pretty soon. Do you mind if I make a phone call? I'd like to check up on that little investment of ours." He grinned slyly. I nodded. "It'll be all right, though. It should be up about a quarter. It'll go the rest of the way before we're back." He left me then to make the call. In his mind was the hope of getting inside information, and he was going to check my prediction before taking any action. Afterward, he planned to call another man to obtain additional financing. I heightened his reaction slightly as he listened to the broker's report. Immediately, he put in another call, and I listened carefully. Evans waited for several rings before the party at the other end answered. "Mr. Blake, please," Evans said. The person answering went to get Blake, and Jim Evans became more nervous by the minute. Presently, Blake answered. "This is Jim Evans." "Oh yeah, Jim," Blake said, surprised. "What's on your mind?" "I've collared a guy. He's really got the market sewed up tight." Evans gave him my name. Blake hesitated for a moment. From somewhere in his mind, the knowledge came. "Huh," he murmured. "Yeah, I think he made a killing in New York." "Now that you mention it," Jim Evans replied, "his name is familiar." A memory stirred, a vague thing, just a slight corroboration. "That's the guy," he said, quickly. "Have you got any dope?" Blake asked. "Plenty, but I need cash to swing the rest." "Is this on the up and up?" Blake asked, suspiciously. "He's at the bar right now. I think he's waiting for a proposition. He's earned me $2,700 so far as bait. I'm stringing along." Blake laughed. "Who wouldn't? Well, you sound him out a little further, and if he'll play ball, give me a ring. How much will you need to work with?" Evans had intended to ask for $10,000, but I blithely urged him to say $200,000. There was a long silence from the other end. "You're down at Marty's today?" Blake asked, finally. "Yeah." "I'll see you there." "Make it 12:30, Evans replied. "I'll feed him first." "Okay, 12:30. "I'm in for 50%, Evans said. Blake's denial was instantaneous. "He'll want 30, Jim, and I expect half of my money. Best I can do is 20%. Take it or leave it. Okay, I was only bidding it up, Jim answered. He hung up the receiver and returned to me with a cheerful smile. Let's eat, he said. He conversed politely and guided me expertly to a nearby restaurant. Throughout the meal, I followed my new policy of examining everything through the minds of several people. The food was barbaric, but edible, and with my mind thus occupied, I was grateful I didn't have to carry on a difficult conversation. Jim Evans seemed content to speculate on the future. Almondo notified me that I seemed more normal now and was no longer apprehensive. What of Jovian? I asked. The same. Will you return soon? I think so, I flashed. I must yet find a place for Jovian and transportation. This is the quickest way to do it. Are you all right? Yes, everything's fine, I answered. Have you had difficulties? Almondo sent a negative thought. I'll hurry to the utmost. Suddenly, Almondo's thought became agonized. What a horrible world! 5 years! But then he caught himself. Perhaps it will be better when we're acquainted. Of course, I agreed, attempting to seem casual and unconcerned. The danger I'd feared was at hand, though more quickly than I had expected. Almondo was not able to tolerate immersion in an alien environment as well as I could, although perhaps my concern for my two friends prevented me from becoming involved in my own difficulties. I turned my attention to Jim Evans. You know, he said after a long period of silence, you made quite a killing in New York a couple of years back. I was rather hoping no one would single me out, I replied. I was hounded to death for dope after that. Evans laughed. I bet you were. I won't pry into your secrets, though. It's not really much of a secret, I replied. It's more the result of hard work, comprehensive study of not only the market itself, but the individual bids from brokers, surveys of production and cost. Anybody could do it if you wanted to work out all the details. Evans chuckled again. If he's got a few contacts on the side. We grinned at each other knowingly, then Evans said, You were making rather small transactions this morning. That's what threw me off the track. I studied him for a moment, speculatively. As a matter of fact, I haven't got too much to work with. I haven't turned a hand for nearly 3 years now, and I didn't get all my figures complete before now. I haven't got as much to work with as I thought I'd have. It'll take me 2 or 3 days now. It's really that certain? Jim asked. Yes, it is, I replied. Maybe, Evans hesitated. You'd, like to speed things up a little? Possibly, I said, guardedly. Have any ideas? Evans debated for a moment, then decided to impress me with the amount. How about 200,000? Could you do much with it? Well, I'll put my cards on the table. I have 3 surefire deals. I could double it before 2:30. Evans had been expecting something, but not this. The light of greed in his eyes and the turmoil in his mind left me slightly shocked. Can you handle more? He asked hoarsely. The more I've got, the more I'll make, I answered confidently. Do you have a proposition? Evans jumped up. Let's go back to the office, he said abruptly. I've got a friend up there. We left the eating place and walked back to the office in tense silence. Evans was obviously almost afraid to hope for what I could do. It was as though he was caught in a trap, not knowing whether to risk his medium of exchange or risk losing a chance to have more. When we reached the office, a tall, thin-faced man with graying hair was waiting for us. He watched us walk toward him, not moving as we did so. Evans introduced me with something approaching reverence. "Mr. Blake, this is the man I told you about." I thrust out a hand. "Ah, Conrad Blake. You're a man I've wanted to meet." I gripped his hand just enough to make him wince. He smiled. "I can't say that I haven't wanted to meet you." I noticed Evans motioning to the broker. The signal answer satisfied him. "Ask them to sell me out," I muttered. Evans pointed to me and made a circle with his thumb and forefinger. The broker nodded. "Well, Mr. Blake," Evans said, "half a point." Mr. Blake smiled again. "Evans tells me you have something pegged." I nodded. "I think so." I looked up at the clock. "If you'll excuse me," I said, nodding to both of them, "I'd like to check the reports. I want to make sure I have this down pat." I drew a list from my pocket. "These are my predictions," I said with a grin. "Mind if I have a look?" Blake asked, his voice tense. "Not at all." The two men followed me as I walked into the room where I'd first met Evans. They watched me carefully as I checked off notations. Blake's eyes were bright and glittering when he found every prediction was accurate. He glanced at Evans for confirmation. Evans nodded, a slight jerk indicating that this was genuine. I decided to break the tension. "Mr. Evans tells me that you might like to work with me." "I might," Blake agreed cautiously. I stated my proposition. "I'll double the amount, whatever it happens to be, this afternoon, and I'll take 30%. Blake gnawed on his lip, studying the floor. "I'm in for 200,000, he said huskily. "I've got 10 more, Evans added. 210,000, I said casually. "All right, I'll take 30% of everything up to 420,000 and 50% of everything over." "Agreed," Blake said without hesitation. How there could be anything over, he didn't know. He left then, and soon returned with an important-looking man. "This is Mr. Carr," he said. Mr. Carr, it turned out, was to handle our negotiations, and we now had a private office to use. We went as a group to the office, and I was seated behind a large, polished desk. The teletype machine was maneuvered next to the desk. Then Mr. Carr drew up a chair before the desk, facing me. He made several telephone calls, then laid the instruments down, the parties at the other end apparently waiting. I began making aimless calculations on paper, read the teletype diligently, made occasional big buys and rapid sales. While doing this, I was using Carr's mind as an intermediary and reaching out tentative fingers to the stock exchange. After an hour, I had the men I needed at my disposal, and I looked at Carr. "Be ready to buy Northern Development," I said earnestly. "Everything we've got." Carr relayed the order over the telephones, and the atmosphere of tension began to mount. This was the killing, and they all knew it. One by one, our securities were realized, and agents stood ready to buy at a word. On the floor of the exchange, speculators, many of them heavy buyers, began to have vague suspicions that communicated themselves like wildfire to others. At first, it was only a slight drop. Carr looked at me, but I shook my head, still making aimless scrawls with a pencil. Suddenly, far away, a man sold. Hardly any time at all passed before there were dozens, then hundreds of sales from all over the country on Northern Development. I had calculated rightly. Panic spread like an explosion. Over my shoulder, perspiring faces watched the reports on Northern Development, one following another too fast to be corrected. Without warning, I barked, "Buy!" Blake grabbed two of the telephones from the desk and Carr two more, simultaneously shouting, "Buy!" Before the phones were laid on the desk, the report came in that Northern Development was down another quarter, then another. There, it stopped. It seemed to me that no one in the room breathed, except myself. I found it difficult to appear as tense as they. I strained my voice and growled at Carr. "Ready to sell? Not yet." "Be ready to sell," Carr quavered into the phones, one at a time. Then, except for the noise of the machine at my elbow, silent minute followed silent minute. At first, there was a slight rise, then another, then a long, steady climb, growing ever faster. It reached and passed the former mark. I drummed my fingers on the desk, trying to make my skin perspire. "Now?" Carr asked. Both Evans and Blake jumped at the sound of his voice, but I shook my head. "Someone has checked on the company by now," I said. "It'll go even higher now that they know Northern is sound." I thought Evans would scream. He was shaking from head to foot, and I rather hoped he would restrain himself for another minute, which I knew would seem interminable to him. At last, allowing for what slight delay there might be, the climax I had first seen was reached. "Now," I said. The words that went out over the telephones must have been confusing, but anything would have sufficed. The agents, keyed to a sound from the telephone, screamed their orders and could be heard even at my distance from the phones. A moment later, it was all over. Evans threw a wad of paper into the air and yelled, "Yippee!" Blake appeared as though he were going to lose consciousness. He was watching the teletype. Already the figures had receded. Carr was listening intently to all of the phones he could hold. Finally, he looked up with a smile. "All our sales at the top figure," he said. Blake looked at me then, his lip twitching slightly. Do you want me to send a check to your bank?" "I'd like cash," I replied. "Right away." Blake glanced at Carr. "I think we can get it figured out," Carr said. "How do you want the cash?" "Assorted." He shrugged and left the room. Evans' happy chattering died down as he noticed Blake standing motionless, a strange look on his face. Blake opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Then all at once, he seemed to become aware of his surroundings. "I'm rich," Blake said, huskily. Evans looked at him sharply. Suddenly, Blake began to laugh, louder and louder. "I haven't got a cent," he roared. "Not a single red cent in the bank. I'm in the red up to my ears." Evans stared at him, shocked, while Blake's laughter subsided. From Evans' mind came a confused picture, trying to imagine Blake without money. "You ran your face for 200 grand, Evans breathed. "My God, I need a drink." "Good idea," Blake replied, still chuckling. He took Evans's arm, then glanced at me. "Care for one?" "No thanks," I said. "I don't feel up to it." As they closed the door, I reflected that this last statement was undoubtedly true. I sighed. Only two things to attend to, I thought, and I would have remained within the code. Redeem my note container and repay the gamblers. Technicalities, to be sure, but I considered them important. I assiduously probed minds and was fortunate in finding several who were speculating on what I would do with my newly acquired wealth. From these, I acquired locations, names, and other valuable information which I would soon use. Almondo flashed a comment. "I do not understand any of this." I reassured him again. "How soon can you come to us?" "Not long now. Jovian cannot stand too much more exposure. I must take some curative steps soon." "I'm doing my best," I replied. At that moment, Carr returned, a surprisingly short time, I thought. He conducted another man with a briefcase into the room. "Here are the statements," Carr said, handing me a sheaf of papers. "I assume Mr. Blake is taking care of the fees." "No, I will," I replied. This seemed to relieve Carr. "In that case," he said, "it'll leave you a balance of $100,480. I perceived that this was regarded as a handsome sum of money and would entitle me to respect and cooperation from nearly everyone. "Are you sure you want this amount in cash?" Carr asked. "It's an awful lot of money. We'll be glad to make a deposit for you in any bank you choose." "It's perfectly all right," I said. "I have an armed bodyguard waiting for me." In a sense, this was true, I reflected. Almondo was waiting for me, and he did have arms, 2 of them. I smiled at the thought and watched the astounded bank messenger as Carr carefully counted the stack of bills before me. It was then that I saw a shortcut in my plans, for which I was grateful. I requested of Carr a private telephone, and he graciously obliged with his own, leaving me in the office. With this instrument, I quickly located clothiers who were only too willing to have the ordered items brought to me. I was able to select clothing, partial wardrobes for myself, Almondo, and you, knowing they would be the correct size. Then I contacted a dealer in vehicles. He seemed a bit dubious, and when I selected the vehicle I wanted, he quickly asked, "How did you know it was here?" Suddenly, I realized that he was engaged in an occupation which had unethical aspects. I found in his mind the name of a man who could have referred me. "Oh, I see," the dealer replied. "Well, you're on our delivery list?" "I'm paying cash, and of course," I hesitated, putting the proper emphasis on the words, "additional costs. I'm sure you can make the arrangements for me." Yeah, perhaps you have a reference?" I gave him a number and told him to ask for a Mr. Carr. A few minutes later, Carr stuck his head in through the door. "I okayed you with the automobile dealer. Do you want to talk to him?" "Is he sending the car?" I asked. "If you want it, he'll be over right away." "That's fine," I said. "I'll tell him that then," Carr replied and closed the door. It was obvious to me that I had made the right decision this morning. If one acquired this medium of exchange, it would unlock any door. True, I had thrown a number of people into confusion, but they kept it well hidden and behaved as though I were doing the normal, everyday things. I waited impatiently now, for I realized that time was growing short. At last, there was a knock at the door. "Yes?" Carr entered. "Here's the man from the automobile agency. Also, there are quite a number of bundles in the reception room, and a man is waiting for you to accept delivery." "Good," I said, and rose from the desk. "Did Mr. Barnes tell you the price on a car?" the man from the agency asked. I shook my head. He loomed close to me and murmured a figure. I selected a number of bills and handed them to him. I haven't any change." He turned to Carr. "Can they break this in the office?" "Forget it," I said. "Buy your kids some shoes." I noticed from this mental upheaval that an investment of $100 on my part would pay dividends. What slaves to money these are, I flashed to Almondo. Yes, of course," Almondo replied impatiently. "But Jovian, something must be done soon. There are people all around here, and I cannot work on Jovian and keep them away at the same time." "I'll hurry," I promised. "Believe me, this is the quickest way and the safest." While I was preparing to leave, the automobile salesman followed me around like a faithful pet. He helped to load my purchases into the automobile and was only too eager to drive it for me so that I might absorb the technique of operation. I noted something I'd overlooked. The car was conspicuous because of its size, and while it was appropriate for my character as a speculator, It was by no means suited to anonymity. We moved through the traffic at a leisurely pace, and the salesman asked, "Well, can I drive you anywhere in particular?" I, "Where can I rent a house?" I asked. My companion's mind flashed to the $100 and thought of more. He devised a plan for prolonging the search to make it appear difficult. I forestalled this by drawing a $100 bill from the roll. His thoughts were too confused to lead me to the man I wanted, so I made up his mind for him. "I'll take you right there," he said. "Yeah, he can do it for you." "You talk to him," I suggested. "Tell him I want it now, and I've got the cash." I described to him roughly what I needed, away from town, neither too small nor too large, and as I described the physical characteristics, I impressed on his mind the picture which would guide him. I flashed a thought to Almondo. "I'm nearly done." He replied, "Hurry." A feeling of desperation grew within me. I knew that time was important, yet I had this one last thing to do. I turned my mind back to the car. I could handle it now, but was it too conspicuous? Then I found another bit of information from the salesman's mind. This car was much faster than the average. That would make up for its distinct appearance, I decided. We slowed, then stopped. "Step on it," I muttered as the salesman got out. As the salesman engaged a man in conversation, I listened with my mind. They quickly agreed that renting such a house was possible, but decided to ask for more money than they normally would dare. I attempted to hurry them subtly, but was careful not to go too far. Then came a frantic appeal from Almondo. "You were dying." I tried to calm Almondo. Never had I come across such a jumbled mind except in these Earth people. After some struggle, I managed to restore Almondo's balance. Yes, I think I can keep Jovian alive, but it's ever more desperate. I'll do my best. Will you hurry?" "I'm nearly done. It'll be only minutes now." Keeping my mind as tranquil as possible, I waited for the salesman and the other man who were approaching the car. I forestalled the sales talk by a brisk, "What's the price?" Confused, the real estate man murmured his exorbitant figure, lamely adding, "Of course, that includes the utilities and upkeep and service charges." "I'll pay what it's worth," I said. I quoted the figure which he normally would have asked. "Is it ready to occupy?" The real estate man was beginning to recover his thinking. Uh, yes." "All right, give me the keys and tell me where it is," I barked. "I'll pay 6 months in advance, and you can bring the papers around later. I'm in a hurry." This stirred him into rapid agreement. As I listened to his monotonous description of how to reach the place, I counted out the money to a near figure. In an instant, I grasped the location, but I could not arouse too much comment. He accepted the money and handed me the keys. "I'll have to get change," he said. "Buy yourself a cigar," I snarled. This shocked him into taking his hands off the door handle. He looked stupidly at the money in his hands, then hastily stuffed it into his pocket. "I'll have to leave you here," I said to the salesman. "Oh, that's perfectly all right, the salesman replied. "Just call on me at any time for anything you want." I slammed the door, cutting off his protestations of undying friendship, waved to him, and started the engine. As I got underway, I decided to attract attention to the car, so I turned on the lights. I expected to have one of the traffic directors pursue me, but it happened sooner than I had hoped. No longer caring for what impression I was making, thinking only of you, who was at that moment dying, I forcibly grasped the mind of a policeman on a motorcycle and held it rigidly under control. Stiffly, he rode his motorcycle abreast of my careening automobile. Then he passed me and took up a position in front, making a deafening racket with a noisemaker on his diminutive machine. Under this protection, I raced at suicidal speed through tortuous streets, finally succeeding in avoiding the heavy traffic. Now I had a straight run, and I made the most of it. For a presumably new machine, this was in appalling condition, though I imagine it was designed for slower speeds. Perhaps it was because of its newness, or perhaps it was my inexperience, but I was unable to pass 95 on the speedometer. At that, the slackness of parts and primitive engineering rendered the machine dangerously unstable. My reflexes were being tested to the utmost, but the strain eased partly when we reached the highway. I released the policeman with a hastily implanted memory of uncertain effectiveness. Apparently, I had been observed, for a large automobile, predominantly white in color, drew alongside almost at once. The driver waved to me, then pulled ahead, setting up a high-pitched howl with his noise-making device. I followed him along the roadway, debating whether or not I should send him about his business. Certainly, with the comparative freedom available, I needed no assistance. If anything, he was an encumbrance. His poor reactions more than once nearly caused us to collide. He doggedly persisted until we reached the stretch of flat, sandy hills which signaled the first half of my journey. I swung the automobile around and pulled off the road. My escort was some distance away and would not be back for some time, considering his abilities. Somehow, some way, Almondo had managed to carry you and our supplies a few feet from the road. I sprinted to where the supplies were piled. Almondo had tied everything into a medium-sized bundle, which I caught up and ran back, throwing it into the front seat. Then I helped Almondo lay you carefully on the back seat. At that moment, the other car returned. A uniformed man leaned out of the half-open door. "Hurt bad, Doc?" I perceived that he had drawn his own conclusions. "Conditions critical," I shouted. Okay, follow me," the other shouted back, slamming the door. I noted that he started rapidly, hoping to put enough space between us so that he would not have those former difficulties. I dared not drive too rapidly, for this primitive machine jerked, bumped, and swayed in an alarming manner, and I felt you would not survive, if shaken up very much. I don't know what became of our escort. He obviously lengthened the lead he had to such an extent that he lost sight of us. He's perhaps still wondering what became of us. "Jovian?" I asked aloud. "The same," Almondo replied. "I've done everything I can, short of operating." I nodded and turned off the highway. Will Jovian?" "Do not worry, Bach," Almondo said. "If Jovian dies, it'll not be because we didn't do everything we could. But there's still time. The injury is not fatal, if I can attend to it soon." We were in a residential district now, so I had to proceed more slowly. I wondered if my efforts of the day had been in vain. Would you live? And then, just as the sun was setting, I saw the house just ahead, our sanctuary for the moment. I maneuvered the car into the small driveway, turned off the engine, and turned to Almondo. "I'll go in first and find a place for Jovian," I said. "Then I'll come back for you." Almondo was watching you, but he indicated that he had heard with a short nod. I took the keys from my pocket and went up to the door. The house was low and somewhat rambling, and I saw no light inside, though I hardly expected any. I doubted if the real estate agent wanted to see me any more than I wished to see him. As I turned the key in the lock, I became aware of a vague uneasiness. I stepped inside quickly, closed the door, and freed my mind of all thought. The uneasiness vanished. Holding my thoughts in abeyance, I probed carefully. I focused my mental perception on section after section of the house, finding nothing. I extended my temporal perception and still found nothing. Then it began a series of thought trains, uncontrolled, following the pattern of an earth mind. I was wasting precious time, and I knew it. The natives of this planet had no knowledge of temporal or spatial perception. What need had I for caution? Yet I carried on. Then, unmistakably, it was there again, that vague uneasiness. But now I recognized it. Almondo had withdrawn from my mind in an instant. He too was on guard. Yes, it was definite now. My mind was being probed. It was fairly easy to mask my thoughts, and the process was simple. My normal mental reactions were nearly 7 times as rapid as an Earthman. Therefore, at 1/7 of the pace of my controlled and hidden thoughts, I carried on the mental reactions of a typical Earth mind. It'd be like speaking very rapidly and occasionally writing a word on paper, thereby imitating the writing of a small child. I began walking, taking pains to fumble for the light switch. I behaved in every manner like a native of the planet to the best of my abilities. When the light came on, I registered surprise and pleasure at what I saw. Inwardly, I thought the living room was anything but pleasing. I continued my acting for some time. Unlike a probe by one of our race, yours and mine, this one was slow. The mind directing it was indescribably alien. Finally, the probe lessened and began to withdraw, not smoothly, but jerking as it did so, like no manner of creature I had ever heard of. Keeping my thoughts at the lowest intensity possible, I flashed a message to Almondo. It will return. I'm blanketing myself as well as Jovian, Almondo replied, his thoughts dying at once. I tested to see if either one of you was detectable, and I hope the alien entity, or was it alien, couldn't detect you either. I wondered if I could have been wrong. Certainly, the inhabitants had the mental equipment necessary, but I had assumed that it was unused. Was I known? Watched? Would those around me that I had assumed were completely deluded tire of their game? Or were there only a few who dared not to reveal themselves? Or was it something else? These thoughts flashed through my mind as I went from room to room, lighting the house. There were 8 rooms in all, 4 of them bedrooms, and I wondered why there were so many rooms with beds in them. None of the rooms was very large, except the kitchen, for which I was thankful. This room would be of use to us, I didn't doubt. There was a little table to one side where we could eat our meals, a rather cheerful place, and it contrasted sharply with the hideousness of the rest of the house. I suppose, though, that this was considered most comfortable by the inhabitants. In spite of its crudity and lack of conveniences, I realized it was a haven and didn't become discouraged. Then it came again, that cold, nameless probing. This time, it was but a hasty glance to make sure that what it had seen the first time was true. The purpose of this probing then became apparent. A thought formed in my mind that I must have more money, that money was valuable, that it could buy anything I wanted. The pleasantness of a drink, of that terrible alcoholic beverage, was pointed out. I was urged to buy a container of whiskey. I allowed the thought to grow in my mind. I decided to have a party and drink an entire bottle that night. There was a hint of satisfaction in that outsider's cold mind. I knew then that he thought he was definitely disposing of a nuisance. I knew also that I've been accepted as a native, a boring one perhaps, but a native nonetheless. Then the intruder was gone, and immediately I tried to follow subtly. I found nothing, and it was as if it came from nowhere. But I knew that I could detect it instantly should it return. No matter where it came from or what it was in reality, it was known to me in my mind. I hurried back to the car and opened the door. Careful now, Almondo cautioned, unnecessarily. Gingerly, tenderly, we carried you into the house. We laid you on a bed in the room nearest the kitchen, Then I hurried back for our supplies. When I returned, I piled them on the floor by the bed and looked to Almondo for directions. He pointed out the right bundles to me telepathically, and we unwrapped them quickly. Much of Almondo's equipment we laid out on the table beside the bed. Almondo examined you carefully, and for the first time, I saw the ugly wound on your head. True, my eyes saw only a slight depression and a bruise, but my perception told me that underneath was a wound causing you great pain and perhaps death. Then Almondo straightened. "I believe we can take time doing this," he murmured. "You're tired. Would you care for a stimulant?" "It might help," I agreed. Almondo selected a small container and took out a transparent globe about the size of my little fingertip. I swallowed this and waited. Presently, I felt my temperature rise, then fall again. I seemed to take new life from the capsule, and much of my sharpness of mind returned. "Ah, you seem much better," Almondo said. I sighed. "Perhaps I've put too much energy into this day." "Possibly," Almondo replied. "You've not had a chance to relax, but—" Suddenly, he was struck by an idea. "Recall in your mind the flavor of the foods you've eaten today." This I did, item by item. "Oh, I see," Almondo grunted. "You see what?" "The food," Almondo said with a smile. "It contains toxins of a cumulative nature, depressing to the body." "What particular food?" I asked, curious. "Most of them," Almondo murmured, going back to the table beside the bed. "What'll we do then?" I asked. "If we cannot eat this food, we will surely starve." "Oh, I rather suspect I can find a fairly pure assortment. I can purify some." He paused to pick up a small instrument. "It's fortunate that Jovian ate none. The foods might well have proved fatal." I looked at you then, lying so still, your breath shallow. "What can we do for Jovian?" "We can do little, but I plan to operate." "Can I be of assistance?" "I believe so," Almondo replied, unconcerned. He handed me a small bubble containing a clear liquid. "Rub this over your hands," he instructed. "Then wipe them on this." He extended a small pad of fluffy material. I did as I was told, allowing the cool wetness of the liquid to sink into my skin. Then I wiped off the excess. I noticed Almondo did the same. After some cautious moving, we adjusted your head in the proper position. Then Almondo fitted an eyepiece over his eyes and began to operate. Time passed, intermittently it seemed. Occasionally, Almondo asked for something or gave me some direction. I felt helpless, yet I knew I was of some use. Through two tiny holes in your scalp, Almondo inserted his ingenious instruments. I watched him work, cautiously yet easily, wondering at his skill. Then at long last, Almondo picked up a little syringe and squeezed 2 drops of an amber jelly onto the 2 small holes on your scalp. We waited a moment, then shifted you to a more comfortable position, covering you with one of our newly purchased blankets. I helped clean and put away the instruments. My back ached and my eyes felt irritated. When I mentioned this to Almondo, he laughed. "But, Bach, you've been poisoned. It's the chemicals in those strange foods. If you'll lie down and rest, it'll pass away. You may become unconscious, but it's nothing serious." "In the name of the star gods," I gasped, "how do the natives survive such things?" "You're not very acute," Almondo replied. "If you'll note the minds which dwell about us, you'll find they are not conscious. They periodically enter a stupor called sleep." "How horrible!" "Oh, it's quite common," Almondo said. Nearly every animal reacts to these poisonous compounds in this way. Often explorers and members of expeditions have this happen to them. The nervous system becomes unable to cope with the effects, and as a consequence, the body relaxes and becomes unconscious, thereby allowing the organic system to break down the poisons. Explorers so affected are restored by eating their own food or ship's rations, though poisoned food can be purified. You're certain there will be no ill effects? The effects are usually cumulative, and in time you would degenerate. However, a single exposure never causes lasting difficulties. He smiled. Go lie down and cover yourself. I can take care of things. I've learned enough from you today to feel quite competent. I was perfectly willing to comply, for I was hardly able to stand. Almondo assured me that he would rouse me if I were needed. I fell prone on one of the beds, not even noticing which room it was. I fell into unconsciousness almost immediately and remained that way, troubled by vague phantasmagoric images and unpleasant sensations.